Welcome to this New Thinking for a New World podcast of the Talberg Foundation. Is the COVID pandemic considered global while Ebola was not, because COVID has laid waste to rich countries while Ebola did not? Is the failure of governments that we see almost everywhere actually the failure of citizens for not demanding more of their leaders? When we ignore the large majority of people on the planet who aren't part of us, the cosmopolitan elite, are we losing a large part of what makes humanity human? Cardinal Michael Czerny, who heads the Vatican's work on refugees and migrants, offers uncomfortable answers in his conversation with Alan Stoga.
Cardinal Michael, the coronavirus pandemic has already generated a deadly tsunami with health, social, political, economic impacts, and many more coming. Governments in most places have done a very poor job, it seems. What lessons do you think can be learned? How do we do better with this crisis and with the crises we're likely to have in the coming years around the globe?
I think a good beginning would be not to put too much blame on COVID. Obviously, COVID is a powerful reality, a powerful force, and it has it's doing its own damage. But the question you asked wasn't really a COVID question. It was a question, finally, about governance. And so what COVID has done is to apply an extraordinary and unusually powerful microscope to worldwide governance. And most of what we see through the microscope's lens is not pretty. It is not pretty at all. And maybe before COVID, we had sort of gotten used to bungling along in this way. And so it didn't necessarily alarm us or surprise us when things went more or less badly. But under COVID, with the COVID microscope, we see the interconnected mismanagements of the different spheres of our lives. While it's tempting to give government a bad report card, it's probably more useful to give ourselves a bad report card and ask ourselves what we're doing to make a bit more sure that we have the kind of governance that we, especially our poor and our planet, need, deserve, and must have. So that would be my first sort of COVID lesson, if you like, or COVID takeaway. Namely that, yes, it's been a terrible set of months with terrible suffering and terrible consequences. But I don't think, at least from the point of view of your foundation and this program, the first big takeaway lesson isn't about COVID. It's about our inability to manage what the Holy Father calls our common home. We are proving to be very poor householders. And we're proving to be very poor members of the same unique and only family that's living in this unique household, this unique home. And we're doing a poor job of it.
To pull on that thread, this is obviously been the first truly global crisis of the modern era, potentially impacting anyone, anywhere. Every continent is affected. Yet the responses have been anything but global. Borders closed, travel stopped, aid stopped, people looking inward rather than outward. And we would have thought that we were global citizens. We would have thought that we could operate at a global level. Why have we, and when I say we, I mean almost everyone, failed to recognize how global this is? You touched on it already. Could you expand a bit?
I would be glad to expand on it, and I would do it by attacking the key word you used, namely global. This is a word that we've been taught and, in a sense, obliged to use, I think, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's when global started to come in, because we were no longer divided into 2 or 3 or 4 worlds, but we were allegedly now one world. So then global came in. And I ask myself, responding to your question, whether the word global isn't overloaded or isn't overrated. Let's just look at COVID for a minute and ask ourselves, if I could use two different modes of governance and ask me which one is the more important. The way you put it, it would sound like your biggest disappointment regarding COVID, it has to do with the World Health Organization. Namely, whatever the WHO failed to do to manage the pandemic globally. From where I sit, I would say, yeah, maybe the World WHO did I don't know, a B job or a B minus, probably not a B plus. But anyway, I'm not judging that, and I don't even know. But what seems to have mattered much more to real people on Earth is how the health system in their respective country, in their respective province or state, and in their respective city or countryside, how that worked. And there the answers are very varied. And there are places with huge GDPs and pathetic health systems and very bad results. And there are places with very little money or none at all, where whatever health facilities they had seemed to do the minimum necessary, and the results are at least bearable. So you say the first global crisis. Maybe I had my global crisis when we started using the word global, and so I don't think it's the first. But you see what I mean? I'm not so sure that global is a helpful lens. It's true, it's around the world. It's true, it's more or less simultaneous, more or less everywhere. But even that's not really true. One of the reasons I think that I'll be a bit harsh. One of the reasons I think we're having this program is because COVID hit the wealthiest countries first. The biggest and the most important countries first. I use those words obviously in quotes. If this hadn't been the case, if this was another Ebola, I doubt that you would have invited me to the program. Sad but true.
Well, I would have, because I very much value your views, and I want to talk about other global crises like migration, like human slavery, like climate, where arguably it isn't the WHOs of the world that are doing a good or bad job, but rather the unwillingness of countries to collaborate together to find common solutions to challenges that I do think are global. And I've mentioned several of them. I know you're deeply engaged with those.
Well, that's right. That's right. And I'll take back some of my sarcasm about global, because you've invited me to comment on the new global compacts, the new global compact for refugees and the new global compact for safe, orderly migration. And these compacts, which were miraculously agreed in the space of 2 short years, and which the vast majority of countries have, or what I could call the countries of goodwill have signed up to. And these compacts are frameworks for collaboration. So they address exactly what you were asking about, where you say the word, you want the word global to mean we're cooperating to face the problems which any person with common sense would say are common problems, or general problems, certainly way beyond the limits of any one nation state, beyond the limits of any one continent, and that need to be dealt with on questions of migration and refugees. It's very, very important that countries cooperate. And if they were to cooperate as the 2 compacts foresee and lay out how to do it, and if responsibilities and burdens were shared, which is, I think, the heart of the matter, that we share responsibilities for what are our shared problems, then migration and refugee flows would be much more responsibly, humanely, efficiently, and usefully managed or governed or governanced. Use the word. In other words, they're not to be controlled, but to be managed.
The compacts are a good example of, as you said, nations of goodwill, people of goodwill, trying to define solutions. I wonder to what extent those compacts are in fact changing realities. And obviously we have a situation in the Americas, which is different than a situation in Africa, in the Middle East, given the current U.S. administration. But I'd even argue that Europe has talked a much better game than they in fact executed when it comes to a humane solution or a humane management, much better word, you're right, a humane management of refugee flows and migratory rights. Now, without going towards this country's bad or that country's good, I worry a lot about the gap between diplomatic solutions, Paris is a perfect example on climate, and actual execution of that changes reality. Am I being too cynical?
I don't think you're being cynical, but I think if I could just broaden your view a little bit, because I think there's a way of saving the situation, at least partially. This is not going to turn your mind right around, but I think it's a bit of good news hidden in all the chaff and the background noise. The two topics which you've now put on the table, in other words, not only migration but also climate, are both complex, let's say, problematics, which include great risks, great costs, and also great potential for good. And both of them happen to be toxic, politically toxic, or ideologically toxic, or populistically toxic. In other words, these are both, maybe today, migrants more than climate. I'd be interested whether you agree with me, but they're both toxic. And what does that mean? I hope I'm not speaking out of line here and revealing secrets which I shouldn't reveal. But in fact, some of the governments which both you and I might be quite quick to criticize are in fact implementing the compacts and are making progress, but they're not in a good position to talk about it. In other words, the behavior or the performance is actually better than the rhetoric. I find that a very happy thought, I must say, although I don't want to say that it solves all problems.
It is a very happy thought, and it's good that it is happening. But at the same time, we've seen migrant communities in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in the Americas, targeted as vectors of infection. It's become very easy to make that accusation because it reinforces other biases and other policies. There is this tendency, I'm afraid, that when things go bad, we look towards lowest common denominators, so closing borders. Even the WHO repeatedly comes out as very recently and said, border closures are not a solution to the problem. Yet borders are increasingly either remaining closed or being reclosed. We see it in Europe, we see it in the Middle East, we see it in the Americas.
I don't know to what extent COVID has made the plight of vulnerable people on the move worse because they're being used as there's a new form of scapegoating that, that's added on to what they were already having. But again, just a little counterbalance, you also have to bring in stories like the emptying of detention centers, where something which good people of sound mind and goodwill have been pushing for ages, that detention is not an appropriate means of handling migratory issues or refugee issues. That you don't imprison people because their legal status is under review, and least of all, you imprison them separately from their children or their parents. So detention centers have been emptied because of the risk or the high probability of infection. And so again, being cheerful, I say, well, maybe COVID provided the excuse for closing these centers, which otherwise public opinion might have, balked at the idea that these people call them illegal we know that they're just irregular people whose papers are being sorted out, needed to be locked up for that reason. Anyway, that's just one anecdote to go against the trend. But I think you're right that well, I don't know if you're right. Whether has COVID made the ideological wars about migrants and refugees significantly worse? It certainly has made their situation worse, at least in the short run, although there are some exceptions. But I don't know. I've been thinking about this in a slightly different way. I haven't used the word leadership, but I have been wondering, or looking for, yes, and wondering about where are or how are the clusters of people who are working together on solutions. And I asked myself whether the COVID crisis has brought us to this rather healthy point where people with good ideas and good solutions and good proposals are able to say, actually, I don't care whether it's my solution or your solution or half of each or 2/3 of one. But I am committed to finding a solution and working on it together. I mean, maybe this sounds like apple pie, and it's not worth mentioning. But I have the feeling that for us to get to the kinds of solutions, which I again go back to the global compacts as examples of, there's no heroes in the global compacts. The global compacts work in a non-heroic way. And I wonder if a kind of non-heroic and maybe in that sense non-leader approach, to put it subjectively, with people's egos put neutral temporarily, at least, so that we can get working together on problems and solutions. Whether that might not be, in a sort of hidden way, the magic of the moment. I wonder whether we should talk about leaders using the future tense, or whether we should just be quiet about that and wait and then say, oh, looking back over our shoulder, oh, I guess we had a leader and it turned out to be so-and-so, and we're so pleased and we're so happy that so-and-so led us. But then that leads to a whole nother problem again back that we were brushing alongside, which is the question of governance. And that is an enormous problem. Maybe it's too big a problem for this one conversation. So on leadership, the way I would translate it or parse it at this moment is the person who might even take the second or third place in the picture, not necessarily the number one position, but who is actually the one who helps the largest variety and possibly number of people to contribute constructively to solutions. And this, to me, is what is, when I see examples of that, that makes me hopeful. And
I love the definition because we don't need heroes. We need heroes in very particular incidents, and often they pop up. A burning building, someone saves people. We do, I would argue, need leaders to develop and execute and gather new solutions. And whether that is, it's probably not an individual, as you said, it's probably a collective. It's probably people from around the world who have different perspectives, different experiences coming together. And I'm optimistic that in some cases, as you just said, these people are coming together with new solutions. But I see an institutional framework which is very, very rigid, very static, that needs knocking over in some cases. And I'm looking for people who are willing to do that, institutions that are willing to say, we've got to do some things differently here, or we're going to end up quite badly. Is that too much to hope for?
It's a lot, but it's not too much. And in fact, I think the Holy Father has had intuitions along the lines that you are articulating. And at least 3 times he has invited what in Spanish are called movimientos populares, I would call them grassroots organizations, to come together and to articulate their, what's on their minds and hearts, what's troubling them, and in each case, it's facilitated a real dialogue between Pope Francis and them. And the three great headings which we've used in the popular movement meetings are housing, work, land, and land including food security. What most moves me and touches me, and what I think is the most relevant to your question, and proves that I'm, again, wildly idealistic, I suppose, but what most moves me is when he says to them, and these are the people who are, let's say, objectively known as the marginalized or the excluded or the peripheral or the etc. He says, there is no solution without you. There is no solution without you. He didn't say it would take longer without you or it won't be as good without you. He said, there's no solution without you. And digesting what that means, I think, is important for us. I say us because I presume, I don't think I'm being harsh, that most of us who are participating and listening and involved in the community around your foundation are privileged people, elite people, very well-off people, proportionately. And so it doesn't quite compute immediately that there's no solution without them, because we haven't counted on them for solutions. We have sometimes talked about them as the problem or as having problems, but we rarely think of them as part of the solution. And to say that there is no solution without them, I think, is a real topsy-turvy way of seeing things, and I think it's very sound. And so when I see examples of it, again, it cheers me up.
How do you not institutionalize that, but how do you broaden that understanding?
I personally, I wouldn't broaden it. I would multiply it.
Which is what I meant by broadening. How do you get people, and that's one of, if you're being optimistic about COVID and a recognition that everybody is potentially exposed to this. So unless you do indeed, you can't build enough walls. You really do need to have a solution where everyone, including the marginalized, maybe most importantly the marginalized, are engaged with whatever comes out of this. One can even think about the vaccine. Vaccinating the rich will not solve the problem. Vaccinating everyone has to be the solution if someday we have a vaccine. We are not conditioned in this world to think in those terms.
Yeah. When you get as concrete as the vaccine, then you're also getting concrete about the capacity, the research, development, and production and distribution capacity, and now we're talking industry. So now this is becoming uncomfortably concrete and specific, and I don't know if that's what you want to talk about, but I think what.
But we're also talking governance and philosophy of governance and inclusion in both the decision making and in execution.
Yeah. But what makes me nervous is that while people like you and me talk governance and all, nice words like that, there's an industrial complex which I don't think it's too strong to say controls this sector of human life. And there are very powerful interests there. And I don't know whether our governance structures have the strength, the courage, the resources, the will to govern. Do they?
And in the absence of that strength, courage, and resources, this won't end well.
Well, it will end as stupidly as the idea of gated communities. the idea that you can gate reality in such a way as to have it good yourself and to hell with the rest, that's a very big mistake. And you said, I think you didn't use the same words and you were more polite, but I mean, basically you said that if we take that approach to the vaccine, it's a non-solution. And you well might be right, or you well might be too idealistic. And the fact is that the only people who have to be vaccinated are the people who take planes. And people who don't move around don't need to be vaccinated because they. So anyway, so we're talking about a solution for the 1/7 of the world that is doing well, which is the proportion of most things that go right on this planet. The 1/7.
This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate. There's a real need at this point to think about where we are, where we need to get to, and how to get there. And you've made a number of suggestions and more importantly, observations that I think are valuable for the people who are engaged with the Telberg Foundation to hear, to experience, to think about. So I very much appreciate the time you spent with us today, the thoughts you've shared, and the invitation which you already accepted, I think, to do it again sometime.
Very good. Very good. Well, especially if we can go out to dinner afterwards.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Thinking for a New World podcast. We welcome your comments and please subscribe to other episodes in the podcast app of your choice. This podcast was made possible with the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.